discuss what a builder's risk underwriter thinks is very, very important. And I think as an agent producing business, this has major ramifications to your book of business. So the kind of the format today, we're going to run through the PowerPoint. I think you'll find it informative. There's pictures in there, kind of pictures worth 1,000 words. We'll run through some examples of what this type of construction is, things that we see every day as underwriters. And at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions. So without further ado, let's get started. Once again, we're talking about superior construction. We're going to define that in great detail, but this is a good picture. The very first picture you're looking at, the vast majority of what we're looking at in this picture would fit superior construction, just to give you an idea. So a couple of things, we're going to run through the definitions, because what I hear a lot of times from agents, I've even heard this from underwriters, you know, it's not really a matter of subjectivity. This is a very defined classification system. It's been around a long time. And it's one of the few things that both ISO and AAIS agree upon. So they agree upon these definitions. They're very close. So the very first type of superior construction is masonry non-combustible, M&C. So if I say M&C today, that's what I'm talking about, masonry non-combustible. And as you can see, it's, wait a second. As you can see, it's concrete block, reinforced masonry, tilt-up construction, load-bearing walls. Maybe combined with some heavy steel framing, commonly concrete on steel deck for multi-story buildings, roof construction, typically heavy steel beams. Now here's the key, a minimum of 1 hour fire rating. We'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. So as we looked at thinking about that first picture we showed of a downtown area, you know, the vast majority of those buildings probably fit the M&C classification. The next classification is called modified or semi-fire resistive. This is protective steel and concrete or heavy masonry walls and floors, semi-wind resistive. Fire rating is less than 2 hours, but greater than an hour. So you can see it's very, very close to M&C construction, just a little longer fire rating. So a little more sturdy, simple as that. And then the pinnacle of all construction types is fire resistive. And this is important, because this is you can't get any better than this. Reinforced concrete construction, building frame and floors are very well protected steel and concrete. Floors are a minimum 4-inch cast in place concrete, precast concrete, or concrete on protected steel. Wind resisted, fire rating not less than 2 hours. That's once again the key, fire rating, 2 hours. As I said earlier, all the major organizations agree with these definitions. For the sake of time today, this is what we're going to focus on. There are a number of other construction classifications, and we've talked about them in past webinars. And if you have a question today, hold it till the end and I will answer it. But the focus today is on basically these 3 types of classifications. Here's some examples. And what I tried to do is throw some out there that are different. Now this applies across the United States, from Miami to Seattle, Washington, New York to Los Angeles. And there is a little different construction techniques around the country, but they still fit this definition. So that's why I put them in there. They can be an older building, the one on the left, a little older. You can see concrete block being installed in the middle picture. And the picture in the bottom left is tilt-up construction, which we see a lot of down in the Southeast, but I'm starting to see it everywhere. So tilt-up concrete construction, you know, many times will meet the criteria for masonry non-combustible. As you think about this too, think about what you're not seeing in these pictures. Just hold that thought and we'll get to it. More examples, kind of bringing this home. This is anywhere USA, from California to New York to Florida. You see these freestanding buildings being built all the time in parking lots. You know, you have a shopping center and then there's a freestanding building being built. Many times those are masonry non-combustible, either concrete block or steel reinforced concrete. And that's what they look like, you know, from the outside. Now I will say this, we're going to talk about it a little bit. A lot of these can fool you. You can look at the outside and think it's one thing, but it's, you know, there's a veneer, there's been something put over something else. So sometimes we have to dig a little deeper to make sure we have the proper classification. So let's talk about this. These are things that we see every day, that there are a lot of them. It doesn't mean they're not a good risk. It just means they're not superior construction. And it does have major ramifications for both eligibility, capacity, and rating. So we'll talk about that, how it affects that. Concrete walls with wood trusses. We'll call that joisted masonry. It used to be very prevalent in housing, not quite as prevalent today, but you have a concrete block house with wood trusses. That is not superior construction. It's joisted masonry. A lightweight steel building, maybe an aircraft hangar or a barn or some kind of storage shed. That's called NC construction. Much, much different than superior construction. The third one down is non-combustible 2 construction. That is the one construction type that approaches masonry non-combustible. And the reason I put that in there is I'm starting to see a little bit more of that, mainly in the Southeast, because it seems to perform very well at lateral wind loads. So it's a good wind type of building. You might be able to talk an underwriter into treating that as M&C as far as rating goes. That's the one exception to what we talk about today. So once again, if you can find some NC2 construction, and you can see the definition at the bottom here, it has to be, it's a heavier weight steel. There's just no concrete in that. It's all steel. Steel frame covered by combustible material. I don't know why they do that sometimes, but I've seen it where you have a steel building and then they put wood paneling around the outside of it, or some kind of, non-concrete paneling. So if you do that, you've turned that building into it's not a masonry non-combustible building. The last one we see an awful lot of, and we see a lot of this on the West Coast. You'll have a masonry non-combustible parking garage in the first 2 floors, and then they'll build a frame structure on top of it, 3 or 4 or 5, 6 stories. I have agents every day that call me and say, well, it's not really frame, it's M&C. Well, a little tip is, it is from a property underwriting standpoint, an underwriter looks at that, they always underwrite to the weakest point of the structure. So if you have M&C on the first 2 floors and frame above that, the entire building is classified as frame. Now, what you might be able to convince the underwriter to do is to give you some credits, because it's not 100% frame, but it's still, you're going to start with the frame base rate and work your way from that. You will not get the M&C base rate on buildings of mixed construction. So kind of what we were talking about was ground up new construction. So let's talk for a second about remodeling and renovation risks. So a lot of times we get stuff submitted and the agent will say it's one thing, and then we look at it. We can look at a picture of the existing building online many times, but it's kind of a guesswork because we can't see inside the building. So the best way to do this is either one, talk to the builder, talk to the contractor, and find out how the original building was built, or even better, go inside the building and look at it. And what I would recommend too is take a picture. If you don't know what it is, take a picture, send the picture to your underwriter and say, what do you think this is? The reason we're spending time on this today is, and this varies a little bit around the country, but the difference between M&C classification and frame can be 5, 6, or 7 times the rate. So it makes it a major difference if it can be classified as M&C. So older buildings, some of the older buildings, especially in the Northeast and in older cities, can't even be classified as fire resistant, and they were built many, many years ago. So it really has nothing to do with the age of the building. It was just how it was built. You do see a lot of M&C buildings in the older buildings, heavy concrete with steel trusses. Might not be fire resistive, but they are masonry non-combustible. I just, once again, always go back to that combustible materials. If there's frame in the building and any of the load bearing parts of the building, it is not M&C. Now, a lot of M&C buildings will have frame on the interior side on non-load bearing walls where they're going to frame the walls and put the drywall up. That's okay, because that's non-load bearing walls. That's another thing we'll talk about in a minute. So it is important, if you go back to that original definition, to make the determination between masonry non-combustible and fire resistive. Some companies treat it the same, but a lot of companies will give you a break on the rate if it's truly fire resistant. So, and that gets a little tricky sometimes on the older buildings to determine. So you needed to work with your underwriter on that. But as we talked about earlier, fire resistant is the pinnacle. You will get the very best rate if a building is classified as fire resistant. Mixed construction types are seen everywhere now. You know, it used to be, I would hear, oh, the West Coast is prone to earthquakes, so everything's frame. It's not necessarily true anymore. We're seeing more and more mixed construction out there. And we are seeing true M&C built even in California. I was looking around the other day and I found a masonry contractors association in California, and they build masonry buildings now in California, even in earthquake prone areas. Different construction techniques, and seems to be working. Superior construction is very common now in the catastrophic wind areas. We're seeing fire resistant single family dwellings being built in Miami. So these are very, very sturdy, risk written, you know, and they're in Miami, but people, you know, the underwriters look at that and say, it's a good risk, even though it's prone to tropical storms. And the last piece here, this is just something I've noticed as I've traveled around the country, that within the same commercial development, you know, you're seeing a lot of these developments that go in that have retail and habitational, apartments, condos, stores, all part of a planned community. Many times within one development, I've seen all 6 ISO construction classifications in the same development. I mean, so it's from one building to the next, it can vary. And that's what's interesting to me. You know, maybe different builders, maybe the same builder. We do have builders that build different within different classifications. I will say that that's another little tip of the trick, a little tip for an underwriting. Usually if you have a builder that builds M&C buildings, that's what they do. They don't build frame and M&C. That's just a little tip. Not always, but it's kind of a general rule of thumb. So why don't we build everything out of superior construction? If it's better, it makes more sense, it's lasts longer, it's not prone to catastrophic problems, it's you know, doesn't burn up as much. Here's the reasons why. First of all, it adds a substantial value or substantial cost to the project. It adds a substantial time of the project to get it done. And there's, you know, and all that translates into labor. And you have specialized labor, you have specialized equipment that requires when you build these superior construction buildings, and the cost of materials. I mean, let's face it, it's, you know, if the cost of lumber is a lot cheaper than steel and concrete, that's what we're going to build out of. But another little tip from an underwriting standpoint, why do you think an underwriter, a builder's underwriter is going to say, what's the square footage of the project? And you're going to say, you know, 10,000. And then they're going to say, what value do you want to insure it for? And they'll give you a value. All they do is look at the value per square foot. And what we're seeing on M&C around the country, it varies dramatically on new construction. But I've seen it around probably as low as $100 and as high as $500 per foot. When you look at the inner city and they're building the high rises, those are built sometimes, many times, $500 a foot. So that's fire resistant construction. The other thing about this is frame structures are limited to a certain number of stories. It does vary a little bit by jurisdiction. So you're not going to see a 30-story building built out of frame. Now we are starting to see these things built a little higher all the time, which is kind of scary, to be honest. In Europe, they're starting to build taller buildings out of frame. We'll just have to wait and see where that goes, but that does add a lot of exposure to these multi-story buildings. And us builders, risk underwriters get very, very nervous when we're looking at a multi-story frame building. A lot of things can happen there. This is kind of my, get on a soapbox once again a little bit, but these things are not subjective. I mean, there is a correct answer. You have to provide the information. What is the load-bearing walls? What is the load-bearing part of the roof? You know, not the roofing material that goes on top of the roof, but what's holding the building up? Is it steel? Is it concrete? Is it frame? What is it? So once you answer those questions, each risk, you know, will fit into one of these classifications. So it's not really a negotiation. Once again, I can't stress enough, pick up the phone and call your underwriter. We see a lot of things misclassified. And I'm not going to be, tell you what to do as an agent today. But let's say you get a quote from the Tumbleweed Mutual. Hope there's not a company out there. I use them as an example. And they misclassified something. It's really a frame building, but they classified it as M&C and it was written as M&C. So it got a very, very low rate. Maybe you're competing against that. So what do you do? Because the other company says, no, this is a frame building. We're not going to classify it as M&C. So, I'm not going to tell you what to do. All I'm going to say from an underwriting standpoint, my job is to try to classify it correctly. So if it's M&C, it's M&C. If it's frame, it's frame, period. Always provide accurate information to your underwriter. I can't stress that enough. Tell us what's going on. Now, I will say third-party verification is pretty easy to Google addresses and look at things and even analyze what the builders built in the past. You get a pretty good feel for what they're building. So there's a lot of information out there. And the key of the so what of all this is really this last line here. If something is M&C or fire resistive, that's the pinnacle of what we're trying to write. It's the very best construction in the United States. So if it's truly that, you're not only going to get the best eligibility, the broadest eligibility, but you're going to get the most capacity, which means, you'll have carriers that will write higher values for you. And lastly, the pricing. Like I said, 1/5 or 1/6 the rate sometimes. I've seen M&C rates on some of these buildings now down in the low single digits. As you know, the frame rates can be 30, 40, 50 cents, much higher. So, that's the range of what we're talking about. So that was kind of it in a nutshell. Hopefully, you got something out of this because it's really critical. So I think the one thing I want you to walk away from this is every building has a correct classification. Let's make sure we classify it right. And from a builder's risk underwriting standpoint, personally, we would like to look at all of the M&C fire resistant projects you can run across, because these are the type of buildings we want to write. So I really appreciate your time today. I think we'll open it up for questions now, and I will wait for the first question. Have a great day.
No questions have come in yet, Jeff.
I like that. I stunned you all, so there are no questions.
You answered everything.
We do see this every day. There's a lot of confusion in the marketplace. What do you think, Jillian? Give it another minute and then we'll call it a day.
Oh, here we go.
One question.
Is superior construction an industry definition or a Schinnerer definition?
Excellent question. I would say superior construction is an industry definition. But having said that, you got to always go back to what I gave you, which is the strict ISO, name. Masonry non-combustible, modified fire resistive, fire resistant. So I've used that term superior construction in my whole career through several carriers. But that's a good point. That's a little bit subjective. So I would just go back to the names of the classifications. Good question. Oh, one other thing, and I forgot to say this, we have a lot of M&C projects that are submitted and the agent called it NC or non-combustible. So be very careful of that, because the non-combustible rates are closer to the frame rates. So keep in mind there's a major difference between non-combustible and masonry non-combustible. Major difference. You guys are all property underwriting experts now.
Here we go. Can you provide a blended rate on mixed construction projects?
Another good question. So the answer is no. A building is either frame, joisted masonry, non-combustible, masonry non-combustible, modified fire resistive, or fire resistant. Now, what I said, having said that, if it's mixed construction, M&C on the first 2 floors, frame above that, most underwriters would say, okay, if the frame rate is whatever, because it's partially M&C, I will give you a credit off that frame rate. Because theoretically, it is a better risk than if it was 100% frame. So it won't be classified any different, still be frame, but you'll probably get a better rate. Good question.
Looks like you can end early. Nothing else.
All right, guys. I really appreciate your time today. Let's see. There we go. And this is another one, a chapter in our educational series on builder's risk. We'll be thinking of new topics and coming up. And if you have ideas, by all means, send me an email and we'll cover any topic you want. What we try to do is bring you the things that we see every day in the marketplace. And we definitely look forward to working with you. And if you have any questions on any risk ever, don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call Donna or myself. Have a great day.
Jeff, another question did come in, if you have a minute.
Sure do. Great.
How do you handle a building addition with a different type of construction class, like a frame building that has an MNC addition coming on?
Excellent question. So the new building, well, let's put it this way. If you have an MNC building and they put a frame addition on it, what have you done? You've just made that whole building frame. I mean, that's number one. Now, if you had a frame building and you were doing an M&C addition, you probably would get a break on the rate for the addition, the value of the addition, but pure underwriting would say it's not M&C because it's attached to a frame building. You go back to that, the basic rule of thumb is you always underwrite to the weakest point. And I have seen that. That's not unheard of. I don't know why they do it, but probably it's cheaper. That's why they do it. So, good question. I like these questions.
Mm-hmm.
That it?
Okay, I think that's it.
Well, once again, I really appreciate your time today. I look forward to doing some business with you, and stay tuned. We will be covering more topics in the future. Have a great day.